What's up, everybody? It's Josh over here with the Manchise, and today we're going to be breaking down UFC Fight Night, Thiago Santos versus Glover Teixeira. Had another pretty successful week last week, the Uriah Hall Anderson Silva recap, and really what I talked about came to fruition. I don't think my claims were very bold, but first of all, Uriah Hall looked super timid. With that being said, he still was able to finish Anderson Silva, and it was just more evidence to back up my claim that Anderson Silva is dust, man. And you heard Dana White say it. Dana White said that he should not be booked for another professional mixed martial arts fight. So, I mean, it's sad to see a legend go out like that, but you're 45 years old, man, and your chin can only withstand so many wars. So shout out to Anderson Silva for a great career, but hopefully we don't have to see him in the octagon ever again. This card, I feel like this overall is a better card than last week's card, which is great. It should generate a little bit more buzz. There's certainly money to be made, so we're going to do what we always do here. We're going to break down things from a betting perspective. I'm going to give some predictions on each fight, and then we'll get into the DFS side of things, and at the end of the video, I'll give you guys another card or a lineup that I put together, hand-picked, and let's keep winning money. So we'll start off with the main event taking place in the light heavyweight division. This is going to be a 5-round fight between Thiago Santos and Glover Teixeira. We'll start off with Santos, who's 21-7 as a professional, 4-1 in his 5 most recent fights. And he's really been a killer since moving up to the light heavyweight division. This is a guy that was just massive fighting at 185, made his way up to 205, and really has never looked back. That one loss happened about a year and 3 months ago. That was his most recent fight in a title fight against John Jones. He lost that split decision. It was super close. I actually think that he probably won that fight. The crazy thing about that fight was, I believe he tore both ACLs in both of his knees, which is just absolutely insane that he was able to go the distance fighting on 2 compromised legs. He looks super impressive, but it's been a long road to recovery for Thiago Santos, and this is the first time that we'll see him in the octagon since he's had those knees repaired. On the other side, you got the veteran 41-year-old Glover Teixeira, who's 31-7 as a professional, and he's 4-1 in his 5 most recent fights in the UFC as well. And he's on a nice 4-fight win streak with victories over Karl Roberson, Jan Kutalaba, Nikita Krylov, and Anthony Smith. He fought Anthony Smith about 5 months ago and just absolutely pummeled him. Super impressive fight, man. At the time of that card, I actually liked Anthony Smith, I'm not going to lie. And he just made light work of him. Now, Anthony Smith did land some big shots early, but Glover's just got a crazy durable chin. Glover also has ridiculous conditioning. It's insane that he's the amount of cardio that he has at 41 years old is just absolutely nuts. So these guys are pretty even when it comes to size. They're both 6'2", both have a 76-inch reach. They're both fighting out of Brazil. So this is going to be a pretty even matchup. And it's interesting to me that Thiago Santos is as big as a favorite as he is. Now, he opened up -220. And the line is evened out a little bit. Last I looked, Thiago Santos was actually more money has been on Santos. I mean, he's at 235, so I apologize. So he opened up at -220. He's now -235. Glover's +200, 2-1 odds. Let's break down this fight. I think the first thing that I'll mention here is Thiago Santos is probably the better striker, pure striker. Really good kick techniques. He's had some highlight knockouts, right? This is a guy that's knocked out Jan Blachowicz, Jimmy Manuwa, Eric Anders. I mean, he just went on a nice tear there where he was finishing everybody. Glover Teixeira has good boxing skills, no doubt. But where Glover Teixeira is really going to shine is his ability to get you to the ground and then really just dominates you with control and ground and pound. And that's what he was able to do against Anthony Smith. So one of the things that I wanted to look at when I was just breaking down this fight was Thiago Santos' takedown defense, and it's pretty solid at 68%. But in the fights where Santos was taken down, he was able to be controlled, and that's concerning, or at least that was concerning to me when I was breaking down this fight, because Glover Teixeira is a very difficult fighter to get off of the ground once he's got you on the ground. So if Glover Teixeira is on top of you, that's going to lead to problems. I think the biggest factor in this fight is what Thiago Santos do we see, because we haven't seen him in over a year. He's had the extensive injuries to his knees. These are all question marks going into this fight, and he's relatively unknown. Whereas Glover Teixeira, we just saw him 5 months ago, and he was really successful against Anthony Smith. I actually lean Glover Teixeira here. It's hard for me, and another reason is I just think those 2-to-1 odds are just too juicy to pass up. The way this fight could go down is, I think it could, in the beginning rounds, be a pretty even back and forth fight. But as this fight goes on, I think it will start to, we've seen Thiago Santos gas in the past. Now, that was when he was fighting at 185. He was cutting a lot of weight, and that probably had a huge impact on why his cardio may not have been great. He's looked much better at 205. But I still have to keep that in the back of my head, especially for a guy that's taking a fight for the first time after a super long layoff. Like, where is Santos' cardio going to be? So I think as this fight goes on, I think it will certainly favor Glover. And if Glover can get Santos to the ground, I think he'll easily have his way with him. So I really like Glover here, and I wouldn't be surprised if he got the finish. Plus 200, 2-to-1 odds. Those are great odds if you're a Glover Teixeira backer. I mean, the guy's been in there with everyone. He's kind of like Overeem, where he's always been a guy that's been in the top 5. He hasn't been able to get the belt, but I think if he picks up a win over Santos here, it's hard to deny him as being the next contender. When it comes to DFS, we'll start off with Santos. He's priced up at 8,800, which isn't a bad salary for him. I mean, if you look at his numbers, he's a very good fantasy performer. I know in the fight against John Jones, he lost that fight. He only scored 22 points, which is crazy to me because I feel like he landed more than 43 significant strikes. But, I mean, before that, 89 against Blachowicz, 119 against Manoa, 108 against Anders, 104 against Holland. And, Santos has a ridiculous finishing rate. Like, he can knock out just about anyone. At 8,800, I will definitely have a few shares of Santos. I feel like this week, though, it makes it a little bit tougher for me to get to a ton of Santos because there's some guys priced up in the high 8s, low 9s that I think have much easier opponents and therefore have the potential to score more points. So I will have a fair share of Thiago Santos, but not a ton of exposure to him. For Glover Teixeira, 7,400, I can tell you this. Any lineup that I have that doesn't have Thiago Santos, I will probably have Glover Teixeira in those lineups. He's priced all the way down at 7,400. Let's just go over his recent fantasy performances. 139 against Smith, 79 against Krylov, 94 against Kutalaba, 107 against Roberson. He had that loss to Corey Anderson where he didn't look great, 10 points. 108 against Serkinov. I mean, Glover Teixeira has been a great fantasy performer. At 7,400, I just love him here. I think he's going to be pretty popular. And if he wins the fight, he'll end up in the optimal. It's not like it's a pivot play to take Glover Teixeira at 7,400, but I will have a lot of exposure to Glover, a little bit of exposure to Thiago Santos. So we'll move on to the co-main event, which is a heavyweight fight between Andre the Pitbull Arlovski and Tanner Boser. Arlovski, a fan favorite and a favorite of mine, former UFC champion, 29-19 as a professional. He's 2-2-1 in his 5 most recent UFC fights. He's got victories over Felipe Lins and Ben Rothwell, losses to Jairzinho Rosenstrike and Augusto Sakai. He also had that toss-up with Walt Harris. For Tanner Boser, he's 19-6-1 as a professional, and he's had 4 UFC fights thus far. He's 3-1 in those fights. Victories against Daniel Spitz, Felipe Lins, common opponent there, and Rafael Pessoa. His only loss was to Cyril Gane, which, man, he's a tough opponent. These guys are pretty similar in size as well, right? Arlovsky's a little bit bigger. He's going to be an inch taller. He'll have an inch to an inch and a half reach advantage. But let's be for real here. Tanner Boser's a big favorite, and he's a big favorite for a reason. He's -300. That makes total sense to me. Arlovsky is just not the same Andrei Arlovsky of old. He is the ultimate definition of a gatekeeper at this point. He's a great guy. When the UFC brings in some of these young heavyweights, he's a good guy to match them up with because it's a litmus test, right? Like, if you can beat Andrei Arlovsky, then it's a name under your belt. It's a guy with a lot of UFC experience. It can begin to propel your career. But if you don't beat Arlovsky, that's a bad sign because he doesn't finish anyone any longer. He's not that dangerous. His chin is questionable, and he's 42 years old, man. And that's what it comes down to. So Tanner Boser has already been in the octagon with guys like Cyril Gane. He's fought tougher competition than Arlovsky. Is he better than Daniel Spitz and Felipe Lins? Yes. So this is still a good fight for Tanner Boser to take because of the name. But I think Tanner Boser should be able to knock out Andrei Arlovsky here. I feel pretty comfortable about that. -300, those odds are kind of, you're not going to win a ton of money, but if I had to bet one way or the other, I'd certainly bet Tanner Boser. When it comes to DFS, I love Boser at 8,900 here. He had in 4 UFC fights, 92 points, 111 points, 16 points where he lost to Gane, but he did go the distance in that fight, and then 77 to when he fought Spitz. So he's been a solid fantasy performer, and at 8,900, I really like him. I like him better than I like Thiago Santos. For Arlovsky, he's priced down at 7,300. I mean, that makes sense to me. He hasn't been a great fantasy performer. His victory against Rothwell, he put up 106 fantasy points, but outside of that, 55, 2, 38, 22, 19, 26, ugly. Definitely ugly. So I'm not going to have any Andrei Arlovsky this week. I'll certainly have a fair share amount of Tanner Boser. Move on to the next fight on the main card, which should certainly be a good one. This is a fight taking place in the bantamweight division versus Raoni Barcelos and Khalid Taha. We'll start off with Raoni Barcelos, who is 15-1 as a professional, which is crazy. And he is, I believe, a former RFA champ. So, the guy is really looked at to be a top bantamweight. I'm actually surprised. I don't think, is he ranked? He hasn't been too active in the UFC, I will say that. I think he's had some injuries. But 15-1, he is undefeated in the UFC thus far, 4-0. Victories over Said Nurmagomedov, Carlos Joaquin, Chris Gutierrez, and Kurt Holloway. And he's got 3 out of those 4 fights he was able to end his opponents, finish his opponents. So his most recent fight, 10 months ago against Said Nurmagomedov, went the distance. And Said Nurmagomedov is no slouch. He's the real deal. He was 13-1 when he fought Barcelos. For Khalid Taha, he fought for Ryzen, he fought for Brave. He's fought for some pretty good organizations. He has now had 3 fights in the UFC. He's 2-1 in those fights. I think his most recent fight against Bruno Silva, there was like a no contest, so let's just call it 1-1. He knocked out Boston Salmon, and he lost to Nad Narimani by decision in his UFC debut. A couple things to talk about here in this one. Taha is He's going to have a reach advantage, but he's 2 inches shorter. And Taha's a pretty good, well-rounded fighter. He's got some heavy hands. He also has some decent submission skills. You know, he's been able to, I'm just looking here, guillotine chokes, rear naked chokes on his resume. But I just think this is going to be a little bit too much for Taha to take on. I really like Barcelos here. Barcelos hasn't lost a fight since 2014. And if you look between RFA and the UFC, he's just about been able to finish everyone. You know, victories over Bobby Moffitt, Dan Morit, KO, rear naked choke, uppercut, ground and pound. I mean, he's just got very legit striking skills. Let's pull up some stats here on this fight. Barcelos is landing 4.79 strikes per minute with a 50% striking accuracy. He's got 83% takedown defense, 2.31 takedowns per 15 minutes. You know, and that's what scares me. You know, Taha has only got a 63% takedown defense, which isn't a great number. He definitely doesn't fight with the same amount of output as Barcelos, so I really like Barcelos in this one, and Vegas agrees. And if you look at the odds, Barcelos is minus 370. He's one of the bigger favorites on this card. When it comes to DFS, Barcelos is priced up all the way at 9,100, and it's not difficult for me to get to him because in his 4 UFC fights, he's had over 100 fantasy points in 3 of those. So I will certainly have a little bit of Barcelos, maybe a little bit more than a little bit of Barcelos, but man, I really like some of the 9K and high 8K options this week. So, you know, it's going to be one of those weeks where I'll have a ton of different lineups, and I will certainly have some Barcelos exposure. For Taha, priced down at 7,100. He's a dart throw for me this week. I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to him. I think there's better options in the 7K range. You know, we talked about Glover. But if you want to build like a super top-heavy lineup and you're going to have a couple 9K options, like maybe you have a Chikadze and Romanov, I think you could do worse. Like, I'd rather have Taha than Simmons or Rogerio de Lima. So he's a dart throw for me, but I really don't expect him to win. So move on to the next fight on the main card, which is a fight between Ian Heinisch and Brendan Allen taking place in the middleweight division. And this fight I am looking forward to so much. I think Brendan Allen he just looks like a killer, man. He looks like a stud. And here he is taking on a ranked opponent in Ian Heinisch, who absolutely slept Gerald Meerschaert with a vicious overhand right in his last fight. We'll start off with Ian Heinisch, who's 14-3 as a professional. He is 3-2 in his 5 most recent UFC fights. Victories over Meerschaert, Antonio Carlos Jr., and Cesar Fajeda. His losses were to Derek Brunson and to Amari Akhmedov, which we're going to touch on that Amari Akhmedov fight. For Brendan Allen, this guy fought for LFA, was also on the Contender Series, and he's now 3-0 in the UFC with victories over Kevin Holland, Tom Breeze, and Kyle Dawkins. So it's not like he came to the UFC and just fought a bunch of bumps. Like, he's fought legit guys like Tom Breeze and Kevin Holland, and even Dawkins looked impressive. I mean, Dawkins was that was a little bit of a back and forth fight, and Dawkins was undefeated even though he was making his UFC debut. This is a little bit of a stylistic clash here, right? Because Heinisch is a guy that's going to prefer to keep the fight standing, though he does have a wrestling background. And Brendan Allen's going to try to take this fight to the ground. That's just the way he fights. He likes to fight with a lot of pressure. He likes to grapple, likes to take you to the ground and either submit you or land some serious ground and pound. Also, must mention, Brendan Allen's going to have a significant size advantage here. He's 3 inches taller. He's going to have a 5-inch reach advantage as well. So we definitely need to take that into consideration. I really like Brendan Allen in this fight. It's hard for me to pick against him. I know Heinisch has a wrestling background, and his takedown defense numbers aren't horrible. Let me pull them up. 62%, so they're not the greatest. But, you know, for me, when I was doing my research, I just kept going back to that Amari Akhmedov fight. And Akhmedov's a really well-rounded fighter. I don't think he has the grappling skills as the same level of grappling skills that Brendan Allen has. And Akhmedov was able to really grind out a victory against Heinisch. He didn't do a ton when he got him on the ground. He was able to control him a little bit, and he was able to get him to the ground a couple of times. Heinisch was able to defend some of those takedown attempts, but my concern here is that Heinisch won't be able to prevent the takedowns. And if Akhmedov was able to control you on the ground, then Brendan Allen certainly should be able to control Heinisch on the ground. I think he seals a victory. To me, what it comes down to is he going to be able to finish Ian Heinisch? And Heinisch has been pretty durable to this point. He might not be able to, which we'll talk about when it comes to DFS. Now, when it comes to betting this fight, this is pretty close. I mean, it's basically a pick'em. Brendan Allen's minus 115, Heinisch is minus 105, so I really like Brendan Allen here. When it comes to DFS, Brendan Allen is priced at 8,400, which, man, it's hard for me to not get a ton of Brendan Allen exposure. 110 points against Holland, 106 against Breeze, 93 against Dawkins. This is a guy that can land some takedowns. He's really good on the ground with advances, which is going to lead to points when it comes to DFS. As far as Heinisch is concerned, at 7,800, I mean, this is a fight I'm targeting, so I might have a lineup or two with Heinisch, but not my favorite high 7K option, especially because I'm going to have a ton of exposure to Brendan Allen. So we'll move on to the next fight on the main card, which is a fight between Claudia Gadelha and Xiaonan Yan, or Yan Xiaonan. Sometimes they're a little bit different in China. They pronounce the last name first, then the first name. We'll start off with Claudia Gadelha. And again, this is a fight taking place in the female strawweight division. Gadelha is 18-4, UFC veteran. She's fought the who's who in the UFC when it comes to women's strawweights. 3-2 in her 5 most recent fights. Victories over Carla Esparza, Randa Marcos, and Angela Hill. Losses to Nina Ansaroff and Jessica Andrade. But let's talk about some of these fights. Split decision victory against Carla Esparza, which really could have gone the other way. Split decision victory over Angela Hill, which really could have gone the other way. Most people scored that fight for Angela Hill, and I would have myself. So if you look at it that way, you could argue that she's really 1-4 in her 5 most recent UFC fights. Now, she had a change of camp. She's fighting with Mark Henry now, and we have seen some improved boxing, improved striking since she's changed camps, which is good. But with that being said, we haven't really seen that translate into a ton of success. One of the reasons why she was successful in the UFC before was because she had really good grappling skills. She's a strong female. She could take you to the ground, grind you out. For Xiaonan Yan, she's 12-1 as a professional, and she's just been a beast in the UFC, man. 5-0 in her 5 most recent fights. She's undefeated in the UFC, and she hasn't lost the fight. Let me just pull up her resume. She hasn't lost the fight since 2010. So victories over Karolina Kowalkiewicz, Angela Hill, Sayuri Kondo, Viviane Pereira, and Kaylin Curran. This is another fight that's pretty close. I mean, they're both just the same size, basically the same height, same reach. And the odds are a little crazy to me. Yan is minus 155. Gadelha is plus 135. That surprises me. I feel like they're giving... I think, the thing is Claudia Gadelha, she still has the name. She's still a pretty highly ranked strawweight. I get that, but stylistically, this is not a good fight for her. This is not a good fight for her because, especially the way she's been fighting recently. Like, if she fights this fight the same way that she fought her fight against Angela Hill, I don't think she has a chance. Because she really leaned on her striking, which makes sense because she's fighting with Mark Henry, or training under Mark Henry, but Yan is just such a better striker than her. More accurate, higher output. Like, let's look at the stats. Yan's landing 6.72 significant strikes per minute with a 42% striking accuracy. to Gedalia's 3.4 and 41% accuracy. And she's absorbing a significant strike more per minute as well. Gedalia's only chance in this fight would be to take Yan down. Yan's got a decent takedown defense at 70%. And Yan, though she doesn't grapple often, when she does shoot for a takedown, she's got 75% takedown accuracy. That number really surprised me. So I think Vegas is looking at this as a step up in competition, but I'm not buying it. I really like Xiaonan Yan here. And when it comes to DFS, since the odds are pretty close, you're looking at Xiaonan Yan at 8,300. Claudia Gadelha at 7,900. I'm going to have a decent amount of Yan. This isn't a fight that I would typically target because I don't think either opponent is going to be able to finish. Either fighter is going to finish their opponent in this fight. So generally, this wouldn't be one I'd target. But it's difficult to not have like a fighter in the low 8, high 7K range. And I think Yan is your best option because she's going to land a ton of significant strikes. In her 5 UFC fights, she's landed over 90 significant strikes 4 times. The only time she didn't was against Pereira, where she landed 71. So she'll put up 78, 66, 105, 85, 111 fantasy points, and that's pretty solid for a fighter priced at 8,300. For me, this week, the difficult part is figuring out who I take between Yan and Bevan Lewis, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. For Gadelha at 7,900, I just don't see the upside. Unless, you have a pretty top-heavy card and you need to take an underdog. And when I mean need to take underdog, like every lineup you put together, you're going to have an underdog. But let's say you have a pretty top-heavy lineup and you need to take 3 underdogs. You might be able to squeeze Gadelha in there because you might think that she could grind out a victory, and that might be all that you need to, especially if you're playing cash, to win some money. So I don't want to completely rule her out, but I just don't love her for GPPs because there's not a ton of upside. 80 fantasy points, 50 fantasy points, 44, 81, 21. It's tricky. If you're a believer that Gadelha wins this fight, then you can definitely get some exposure to her at 7,900. I just don't think she has the upside. I think Yan has the upside because she's going to have more output. So even though she doesn't get the finish, if she lands 100 significant strikes and wins the fight, she's going to put up anywhere between 80 to 100 fantasy points. And, that's solid output for a fighter priced at 8,300. All right, so we're going to move on to the next fight. This is your featured prelim. It's a fight between Giga Chikadze and the UFC newcomer Jamie Simmons, taking place in the featherweight division. We'll start off with Giga Chikadze, former Glory kickboxer. He's been super active. I've talked a lot about him on this channel. He's 11-2 as a professional and 4-0 in the UFC, which is crazy to me, but victories over Brandon Davis, Jamal Emmers, Erwin Rivera, and just a month ago he beat Omar Morales, which shocked me. It was a very impressive fight. He's taking on Jamie Simmons, who's 7-2 as a professional. He's fought on the regional scene. This is a guy that's got a pretty good overall game. Has some submission skills, has some striking skills. But the issue with Jamie Simmons in this fight is this is a big step up in competition, and he will be disadvantaged when it comes to size. He's only like 5'6", I believe. Chikadze's 6 foot tall, and Chikadze will have a reach advantage. That really plays into his favor as a kickboxer. He should really be able to control the distance. To me, it's all about Chikadze's takedown defense, because if this ends up being a striking match, he should run away with this one. And so far, Chikadze, 65% takedown defense in the UFC. It's not bad. I think the thing with Chikadze is he's a hard guy to shoot in on because of his kickboxing techniques. He has no problem coming up the middle with a front kick or a knee. And Jamie Simmons is definitely going to have to be concerned about that. Chikadze's the biggest favorite on this card, which makes sense. As I mentioned, huge step up in competition for Simmons. Chikadze, as I look at the odds right now, is, let's see here, wow, minus 750. That's insane. So no money to be made on him unless unless you want to bet the unders or something like that, or Chikadze by finish. Let's talk about this fight from a DFS perspective. Chikadze priced up at 9,300. Hard for me to get to him because I haven't seen him finish anybody in the UFC. Should he finish Jamie Simmons here? Yes. But he's also not like the most aggressive fighter. You know, he is a boxer by trade or a kickboxer by trade, so you know, he's a more technical fighter than a brawler, and sometimes that can lead to just you winning victories by points. You know, you're hitting your opponent and you're not getting hit. He's not the highest output striker either. You know, the most amount of fights the most amount of strikes that he's landed in a fight is 65, which isn't a crazy number. So it's just hard for me to get to him at 9,300. He's a shoo-in for a victory, I'll tell you that. So, I mean, I might have a lineup or two with him, but I just don't see a ton of potential for racking up a lot of points. I mean, he could finish Simmons early, and then if he does that, he'll put up 100. But I don't know. I mean, I think Simmons is tough. He's 7-2. His 2 losses. Let me just look. He lost to a knee in 2019 to Jake Childers, and then he was guillotine choked by Donnie Simpson in 2018. So he has been finished. I just think there's better options in the 9K area. For Simmons, I will have no shares of him at 6,900. I just don't expect him to win. And I don't want to have any shares of someone that I don't see a path to victory for, and that's just what it comes down to. So we'll move on to the next prelim here, which is a fight between Trevin Giles and Bevon Lewis. We'll start off with Trevin Giles, who is 12-2. This was a guy that was booked for a fight not too long ago and passed out. Apparently, like, his heart stopped. Something crazy right before the fight started. And it's a shame because I had some Trevin Giles shares. And, that was just a wacky card. I think 3 fights ended up, like, dropping off, like, the night of the fight card. But anyway, it's besides the point. Trevin Giles, 12-2 as a professional in the middleweight division. And he is 3-2 in his 5 most recent fights in the UFC. Victories over James Krause, which was a back-and-forth fight. James Krause took that on super short notice and moved up the middleweight to face him. Antonio Braga Neto and James Boknovic. His losses, Zach Cummings and Gerald Mearshart, and both of those had a common theme. He was guillotine choke in both those fights. For Bevon Lewis, he's 7-2. This is a guy that was on the Contender Series, knocked out Alton Cunningham and looked super impressive in that fight, but we just haven't seen it in the UFC thus far. Now, he's fought pretty tough competition. He's 1-2 in the UFC. His losses were to Uriah Hall, Darren Stewart, and his victory was to Daquan Townsend. But the problem with Bevon Lewis is he's just not a high output striker. We know that he can finish just about anyone. We've seen it. I mean, that knockout on the Contender Series was just really nice, and he was a good fighter for LFA as well. He kind of reminds me of Uriah Hall. Just very patient, which usually isn't good for fantasy purposes. Bevon Lewis is going to have a height and reach advantage. 5 inches in reach and 3 inches in height. And he needs to use that in his advantage in this fight, and I think he will. He typically does. And I think that's another reason why he hasn't been such a high output fighter. I like Bevon Lewis in this one. This is one that I expect to be standing the entirety of the fight. And I think Bevon Lewis is just going to be patient, and I think he'll be able to pick Trevin Giles apart. Looking at the odds, Bevon Lewis is a slight favorite here. Let me see, minus 115. So it's basically a pick'em. It's pretty close, but I lean Lewis. When it comes to DFS, man, it's difficult. I mean, this is your 8,000, 8,200 matchup, and initially I really liked Lewis, but it's just 36 significant strikes landed against Townsend. 31 against Stewart, 68 against Uriah Hall. It's just been, he's just not a high output fighter, and it's tricky because, when I look at Xiaonan Yan, who's landing 90 to 100 significant strikes in almost all of her UFC fights, it's hard for me to not favor her over Bevan Lewis. Will I have a lineup or two with Lewis in it? Probably, just to diversify. For Trevin Giles at 8K, he's difficult to get to. He's just difficult to get to. This isn't a fight that I really want to target, especially with these price points. He's not the worst 8K option, but he's just not the greatest fantasy performer either. 80 points, 29, 16, 90. And this is a tough fight for him, because he's going to be so disadvantaged when it comes to size, and he's fighting a really technical striker. I just don't see the potential for him to rack up a ton of points. So we'll move on to the next prelim, which is a fight taking place in the heavyweight division. It's my boy Alexander Romanov fighting Marcos Rogerio de Lima. Let's start off with de Lima, who this is a guy that at one point fought at light heavyweight. He's now moved up, or since moved up to heavyweight, and he's 3-2 in his 5 most recent fights. Victories over Ben Sassoli, Adam Wigzorek, and Jeremy Kimball. Losses to Oven St. Preux and Stefan Struve. And he's a little bit of a smaller heavyweight. He's 6'1". He's got a 75-inch reach, but he's not the biggest heavyweight. And he's taking on Alexander King Kong Romanov, who's undefeated, 12-0, and he's 1-0 in his UFC career. He was able to sub Roque Martinez. Martinez took that fight on short notice. I think that was an easy fight for Romanov. Romanov just ragdolled him. He could have ended that fight a million different ways. He was just taking him to takedown city, takedown after takedown, landing massive punches, ground and pound, hammer fists, and eventually was able to sub him. I want to talk about Rogerio de Lima for a moment, because there is a huge discrepancy in talent that he's faced where he has victories versus the talent that he's faced when he's lost fights. So he's lost to Stefan Struve. He's lost to Oven St. Preux. He's lost to Gadzhimurad Antigulov. And he's also lost to Nikita Krylov. And those guys, Oven St. Preux's a solid fighter. Krylov's a solid fighter. Struve at one point was pretty solid. Antigulov kind of stinks. But, we just went down the list before with his victories. Ben Sassoli, nobody. Jeremy Kimball, nobody. Clint Hester, a nobody. Igor Pokrajic, a nobody. It's very clear. He's a guy that is going to beat people that aren't UFC caliber, but when he fights UFC caliber opponents, he's going to lose, which is why Romanov is such a big favorite here. Romanov's minus 410, and he opened minus 280, and the money just came flooding in because he looks impressive. So I love Romanov in this fight. Absolutely love him. When it comes to DFS, Romanov priced at 9K. That's a steal to me. This is a guy that put up 148 fantasy points at one point. And, the only concern here is de Lima does have some decent jiu-jitsu skills. So if he is able, if Romanov shoots in for that takedown, he's got to just be cautious. And he should have no problem taking down de Lima. De Lima's got a 36% takedown defense, which is absolutely putrid. So he'll be able to take down de Lima at will. Just got to be cautious to make sure that, he doesn't get subbed. But I think he'll be fine because I think he'll really be able to control de Lima and land some heavy shots from up top. I think Romanov actually ends this fight in the first round pretty early with some significant ground and pound. So at 9K, I'm going to have a ton of exposure. De Lima at 7,200, no thank you. Don't really want too much of him. He's had some good fantasy performances in his career against bums. He's also had some stinkers along the way. And, Yeah, it's just 7,200. He's just not someone that I'm too excited to have, so I will have no exposure to him. So we'll move on to the next fight on the prelims, which is a fight taking place in the featherweight division between Darren Elkins and Eduardo Garagorri. We'll start with Darren the Damage Elkins, who's 24-9 as a pro, but he's 1-4 in his 5 most recent UFC fights. He's on a 4-fight losing streak. Losses to Alexander Volkanov, Ricardo Lamas, Ryan Hall, and Nate Landwehr. His victory was that victory where he subbed Michael Johnson. Eduardo Garagorri is 13-1 as a pro, but he's just 1-1 in the UFC. He had a victory over Humberto Bandenay and a loss to Ricardo Ramos. He was subbed in that one. Here's the thing. Eduardo Garagorri is fighting out of Uruguay, and Uruguay does not have a great MMA scene. So his record, in all honesty, is padded. And if you look at his opponents, you can see that. Victories over guys that were 0-0, 0-0, 0-0, 6-15, 5-1, 2-3. Like, just fought a bunch of cans. And, even Humberto Bandenay, the victory that he had against him, Bandenay is a guy fighting out of Peru and was 1-3 in the UFC. Just didn't look like a UFC level fighter. So, we got to keep that in mind. And when you look at Darren Elkins, even though he's lost his 4 most recent fights, 3 of those fights were really difficult fights. I mean, Volkanovski, Lamas, Ryan Hall, those guys are guys that you just don't want to fight. But he's got victories over Mirsad Bektic, Godofredo Pepe, Chaz Skelly, Dennis Bermudez, Michael Johnson. He's been in there. This guy's he's been around forever, right? He's been in the UFC since 2010. This is a guy that fought Dwayne Ludwig, Charles Oliveira. This guy is just, he's been in the octagon with the who's who in the featherweight division. I think this is a huge step up in competition for Garagorri. Now, Elkins is a stupid fighter. And I don't mean that personally, I just mean he's a guy that takes a lot of damage. That's why his nickname is The Damage. And he's got a ton of scar tissue. He's going to bleed. That's a lock. But I think what this fight comes down to is this is a big step up in competition for Garagorri, and Elkins has really good grappling. He's really durable. He'll grind out his opponent. Garagorri, from what I have seen, is not a good enough striker to dominate this from a striking perspective, or to even be dangerous enough from a striking perspective. And I ultimately don't think he'll be able to prevent Elkins from really dominating in the clinch or even taking Garagorri down. So I like Elkins in this fight. Vegas agrees with me here. Elkins is a minus 240 favorite. Elkins is priced up in DFS at 8,700. Don't love that because he's not really a guy that's going to secure a ton of finishes. He's more of a grinder. Now, he's had some performances where he's landed like 6 or 7 takedowns and landed a decent amount of significant strikes. So I'm not going to rule him out entirely. I will certainly have a little bit of Darren Elkins. For Garagorri, 7,500. I feel like a broken record all night tonight so far. A lot of these guys, I just don't love a lot of the underdogs on this card. I have to be honest. So Garagorri at 7,500. He's not the worst pick here because Elkins has been struggling and he's an older fighter. He's taken a lot of damage. I think I will have a lineup or two with Garagorri, but not my ideal 7,500 price point fighter. I really like Glover much better. And there's another fighter that we're going to talk about in a moment as well that I like. So we got another fight to go over here. This is a fight between Max Griffin and Ramiz Brahimaj. So we'll start off with Max Griffin, who's 15-8 as a professional in that welterweight division, but he is 1-4 in his 5 most recent fights. Losses to Curtis Millender, Thiago Alves, Alex Morano, and Alex Oliveira. His only victory was to Zalim Imadiev, who is no longer in the UFC and I think he was like 0-3 or 0-4 in the UFC. He's taking on a UFC newcomer here, an LFA veteran, Ramiz Brahimaj, who is 8-2 as a pro and 3-2 in his 5 most recent fights. This is a little bit of a clash in styles as well in this fight. Max Griffin's known for being a boxer, even though we've seen a ton of grappling from him recently. And Brahimaj is a guy that's got pretty good jiu-jitsu skills. And if you just look at his resume, let's see here. Out of his 8 victories, all eight of his victories were finishes, and they were either some form of a submission. So arm triangles, rear naked chokes, guillotine chokes. That's Brahimaj's game. Max Griffin, on the other hand, though he's definitely the more experienced fighter, just hasn't looked very dangerous in the UFC, right? I mean, his one big victory would be his victory to Mike Perry, which was a pretty close fight. He won that fight. I actually saw that fight in person. It was down here in Florida. I thought it was closer than really what it ended up being. It was a unanimous decision victory for Griffin. Griffin just outpointed Perry. Perry was pretty young in his UFC career at that time, and was just trying to land the big shot, and Griffin was able to kind of just pick him apart, and then when they did engage, he just kind of grappled and neutralized Perry, and that's really what we've seen from Griffin. That style doesn't lead to a lot of victories, which is why he has split decision losses to guys like Alex Oliveira and Thiago Alves on his resume. So, this is a tricky one because Griffin's a well-rounded fighter. He's the more experienced fighter. But to me, he's got to keep this a boxing match, and he just hasn't shown the tendency to do that recently. Because if this becomes a grappling match and Brahimaj is able to get Griffin on the ground, he's going to have a significant advantage in his jiu-jitsu and could ultimately sub Max Griffin here. Now, Griffin's a pretty sizable favorite. Initially opened at -170, but the odds started to swing. He's all the way down at -140 now, and to me that makes sense. I like Ramiz Brahimaj here. I think he is a live dog on this one. And when it comes to DFS, as I was just mentioning, there are some 7K options I do like this week, and Brahimaj is certainly one of them. Priced down at 7,700, a guy with a 100% finishing rate, and he's making his UFC debut. The casuals might not know who he is, and he might not be the most popular pick this week, so I really like him at 7,700. Max Griffin at 8,600 makes 0 sense to me because should be a tough fight. This is a guy that only has 1 finish in his 8 UFC victories. So 8,600, I really don't want anything to do with him. He only averages 59 fantasy points per fight. It's not great. So yeah, I'm going to stay away from him. I am certainly going to stay away from Max Griffin. So let's move on to everyone's favorite segment. This is a segment where I'm going to give you a free lineup courtesy of the Manchise. And we've been on a nice little streak the past couple weeks here. And I think this week will be pretty successful again. So I like Romanov at 9,000. I like Tanner Boser at 8,900. I like Brendan Allen at 8,400. Xiaonan Yan at 8,300. Brahimaj at 7,700. And Glover Teixeira, believe it or not, at 7,400. So, like always, guys, if you could subscribe to my channel, like this video, I really appreciate it. Every weekend I'll be breaking down each UFC Fight Night or pay-per-view card, giving you guys a lineup as well, and let's continue to win money.